but you already have troops that have taken over like a large section of the northern part of your country that are there. And I'm like, 87, 88, it was a dictatorship. It was a totalitarian dictatorship, but no one was getting killed in large numbers. We don't start seeing mass displacement and large numbers of people getting killed until the invasion. So I'm like, the plane was bad, but the interstate war was worse. Now the planning thing, I think you're right. I'm like, if I could find those documents that showed, you know, the Chinese ships that kind of sent the machetes into the country and the disbursements of the weapons ahead of time. But my thing is, people with far more resources than myself, the ICTR and so forth, they've been trying to find the kind of like smoking gun partially to kind of identify what the nature of the relationship was with the preparations. And I'm like, no one's shown me any kind of information that definitively, clearly identified what was going on. Now I'm like, you don't kill a couple 100,000 people in an uncoordinated way in a few weeks. So clearly there's some plan. And so if you take in my simulation just the red squares. So if you're just looking at the large scale killing, and that's the stuff above, that's the stuff above like 1,000. I mean, these are the places that I think, you know, we need to focus in on. Because I think there's something to be said about places where more than 1,000 people are killed, or 5,000 or 10,000 people are killed. That suggests that there's coordination. You need coordination to pull that off. And so I think that's kind of guiding the effort now. Part of my thing is, it's hard to go back prior to 94, in part because this is the reason I was doing the kind of like media content analysis, hardly anyone's paying attention to them. Allison was one person paying attention to it, but Human Rights Watch's attention span, and even Amnesty occasionally, it's not as persistent as it needs to be. They got some flashpoints about things that were going on and some hate speech, but they weren't tracking weapons. They heard some rumors about training taking place, but no one had like a map of these are the training camps throughout Rwanda. Here's the code book of what they were using for the guards to the training. So what we have is just kind of relatively spotty information about that. And it's hard to go from that to the concerted plan that would be necessary to kind of talk about some of the issues. So you don't get this unless you have a plan. But we don't have the plan, and the information we're getting from people now is just so distorted, it's really hard to kind of piece together what that plan was. So if you have some way to kind of navigate that, then fine, but in 12 years I haven't figured this out. And with all the attention given to the 100 days, that's one of the reasons why I have so much information. Because a bunch of people said that that's what we focus in on, the 100-day period. I mean, Minaloke, the Minister of Local Affairs, they have some information on some Civil War violence, but no one talks about that report anymore. They talk about other stuff. Oh, sorry, I'll come to you. Yep.
If we knew exactly who did it and they were prosecuted to the fullest extent of international law, would humanity be better off? And I haven't followed.
The people who did that?
That's what we're talking about.
Define better off.
Would it be a benefit to humanity?
As a social scientist, I'd say yes. Since most large-scale killings, the locations tend to recur, which suggests that there are repeat offenders internationally, and so we would do our best to contain those individuals. You had a follow-up?
Which are more beneficial to humanity.
I think Rwanda would love to hear those. Okay.
I was going to ask, what does the events of 90 to 92, how does that play into your narrative, if at all? After all, I mean, it's so often forgotten that there was what looks like a civil war. I mean, you can tell me what you think about it. It looks like a civil war, 2 years earlier. I would think that would tend to corroborate your story, because one could say that, look, there was something very much like a civil war with very large-scale death 2 years before the genocide, whatever exactly it was, starts. Does it make sense that that might be a continuation of you do with those years?
I mean, so with the invasion, you have the commandeering of the northern part of the country, but you also have the move of several 100,000 people into Kigali. But then you also have, from Burundi, individuals that are fleeing, that are coming into the country from an earlier killing there. So you've already got people kind of positioned within the country who don't have any kind of local connections, who are easily riled up and trained to do different things. So I think clearly there's a dynamic there. And then, I mean, if you just, I mean, I stopped in '94, but clearly '94 to the present then involves this other issue of then the kind of relationship between Congo and the Rwanda, and so there is this continuity. So I think there's a large amount of kind of bracketing of, if we're just trying to understand Rwanda '94, what kind of purchase can we get on doing that? But I believe that we need to actually, part of the kind of broadening temporally argument was we need to kind of go back a little bit further than we do. I'd actually go back before 1990 to start looking at the training in Uganda and what's taking place to Tutsis in Uganda, but also let's more seriously look at what's going on with Tutsis and political moderates in Rwanda in '86 and '87. We kind of forget about that process, but then also push it forward to come up to '98 and 2000. Part of the issue there is getting information about what's actually going on in Rwanda and around Rwanda at the time is extremely contentious. I mean, but we know there's all types of raids that are taking place within Rwanda, but that serves as cover for some activities that they're doing, and then objectivity with regard to those announcements becomes somewhat problematic. But then the persecutions of people within Rwanda in terms of that political space in the upcoming election. So I think I'm all for more information, pushing both behaviorally and temporally. So I think part of the problem with Rwanda is Rwanda now is synonymous almost with genocide by itself. We forget behavioral context. We also forget temporal context. And we're rewarded for doing that, and we're sanctioned for violating it. So I'm trying to get to more of that. Yeah.
Question. When I was watching the animations, especially of the battlefront moving, and even with the maps that showed the low-level conflict, not just the high stuff like this, there was rarely any actual deaths on the battlefront.
Yeah.
So how is the RPF advancing through the country without any deaths on the battlefront?
Dallaire says in his testimony in ICTR, and also within his book, it's because the FAR was weak. They were running. They weren't trying to fight. They acknowledged relatively early on that they did not have the capability to take them on in a kind of standing battle, and thus it becomes these skirmishes. So there's very few of those kind of violent activities. These are the lower killings, below 500, I believe.
Firing from top of the hillsides, almost hurting the FAR off the front line, just by positioning themselves around the country and firing in the air and just scaring them into leaving the area, making it look like they were larger in numbers. They're very incredible tacticians.
FAR needs to watch more movies.
These could have been killed. It's just a logical possibility. You don't need any simulation. Any of the numbers out there that look like 600,000 to 1 million, you're going to see that, you don't need to know where they happened at all. You just need the absolute numbers to derive the fact that a lot of Hutus, and probably more than Tutsis, were killed. And that just strikes me as surprising. That the question then is, you would think that other people would notice this. I mean, and it makes me wonder, having been in the developing world a bit, how reliable are those numbers you're relying on? I mean, how confident are you that you've got the right number of Tutsis before? Because statistics offices are famously bad at measuring numbers. They're often very politically motivated. And so, I mean, that's got to be absolutely tight for your whole argument to work, because if that's off, then everything goes off, as far as I can tell.
Well, so part of my thing is, it's kind of interesting. So if the Rwandan government isn't thorough in identifying ethnicity, then you don't have the strong state that's necessary to conduct a genocide. That seemed to always follow for me. So I'm like, okay, either they're good or they're not. If they are decent, their number 600,000. Do we get that number or anywhere close to that number through any other ways. So some went back to the census for 73 and imputed forward. They're like, okay, that's more or less in the realm. Okay, but 73 could be off as well. But it's a different political context. It's a little bit less sensitive. So then some go back even further to kind of Belgian censi, and then they kind of project forward. Is it in the margin of error? Yeah. What's interesting is neither one of those talked about how many people you thought left in 59 and 60. And so we just kind of came up to that. And then no one considered the UNHCR kind of flight in and out of the country. And so what's the ethnicity of the people leaving? If you accept the narrative that potentially persecuted individuals, the Tutsi in this context, or politically challenging Hutu would leave, more on the former than the latter, then that plays with that kind of general estimation. So part of the reason for doing this was we either think the governments are good at identifying their people. So William Seltzer makes this whole argument that most genocides follow censi. That's just how governments find who they're trying to kill before they go do it. So that kind of argument works. But if they're bad with that estimation, then how are they so good at tracking down everybody later on? I'm like, it just, it didn't make any sense. So the only reason I kind of went in this direction with regards to focusing in on, do we have any other concurrent validation for the census estimates, is to kind of tease out the state capacity bit. Either they do have some capacity, in which case the rest of the narrative makes sense, because if they're not good at identifying the population, then they're probably not good at giving out the ID cards, and then they're probably not good at manning, so all these implications kind of follow from the efficiency of the census. So that range in and of itself was kind of like, granted, this is like 3 weeks old, because it just occurred to us. We had the UNHCR data for like years, and we were just like, wow, what if we considered people leaving the country and consider that relative to these other estimations, and then we delved out this, and we were like, what about 59? Really, we just got back to 59 a couple of months ago, because we were just like, wow, we're just assuming that number back then was correct. But is there any other information about people leaving? And then you get to the politics of it. The RPF don't want to make it seem as if a whole bunch of Tutsi left back then, because that decreases their mandate later on, the legitimacy of their invading another country. If there's 5,000, extreme, if there's 5,000 Tutsi in the country and the majority of the people left, there's no mandate for coming in and invading. That's our land. So you need enough people that are there to kind of justify you going in, but not too many to make it seem like you're a minority that are just kind of kicking your way in there. So the politics of that number and the difference and the range seem to be kind of like really important enough to kind of go into. But I'm definitely sensitive to your point. You had a point? Oh, sorry.
Take one more question, and then you can ask a bunch of that important questions if you really have to come around for a while. But I'll take one more.
A comment you made, I would like you to clarify. I'm Rwanda. You said something like whenever the RPF stopped, whenever they pushed them, there were more killings. Are you saying that there were more killings because RPF was pushing, or because the FAR were running and killing more people on the way?
Both. I'm saying the FAR push, the RPF push forward. People are flying. The RPF is fleeing, and they're killing. The FAR. Yeah, if we're doing the actual bodies doing the killing, that's the FAR and their associates. The context within which they're doing it, the RPF has just pushed them, and then they're engaging in killing. That would be a follow-up, but go ahead.
I almost agree with you that more Hutus were killed. I'm not a scholar. If I think that more Hutus were killed because there just were more Hutus in the country, so it makes sense that more Hutus would die. Am I wrong? Not because the RPF killed them.
I don't think it was clear at all who anybody was, and in that context, anybody who was fleeing or congregating was viewed as threatening, and they were killed by all parties.
It's clear we could continue discussing because of this terrific presentation for a long time, and come ask individual questions, but I'm sure you have other things to do eventually. So thanks very much for